Hello, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1195th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme privilege to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Camille Henrot and Allison Glenn. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Camille Henrot is recognized as one of the most influential voices in contemporary art today. Over the past 20 years, she has developed a critically acclaimed practice encompassing drawing, painting, sculpture, installation, and film. Inspired by literature, secondhand marketplaces, poetry, cartoons, social media, self-help, and the banality of everyday life, Henrot's works capture the complexity of living as both private individuals and global citizens in an increasingly connected and overstimulated world. And our host today, Allison Glenn, is a New York-based curator and writer focusing on the intersection of art and public space through public art and special projects, biennials, and major new commissions by a wide range of contemporary artists. Glenn is the artistic director of The Shepherd, a 3.5-acre arts campus, part of the newly christened Little Village Cultural District in Detroit, and the curator of the 2026 Toronto Biennial. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Allison to get us started with gratitude to Allison and Camille.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to be in dialogue with the brilliant Camille Henrot. Camille, I'd like to start with your current exhibition at Hauser, A Number of Things. Within this exhibition, there's an undercurrent of playfulness, and it presents how we might make meaning across objects and ideas, including a strong reliance on the tension that emerges between discipline and freedom. And I'm wondering if you could start us off by elaborating on
that. So I think that maybe I could start with like the idea of the title, A Number of Things.
Yes.
We had a long conversation with the title ideas with Alexi Laurie, the curator of the show. And I realized that the reason why I was attracted to this title was because there's two key elements in it. One is the notion of number, like the way the structure of mathematics is dominant and now in our life, and it's actually something new. And things, which is a word for what cannot be described yet by a word. And so I think that's one of the very departure point, like very start and continuous line in this exhibition is the relationship also with the prelingual. Because I think that one of the things that I was really interested in is the way there's an articulation between the non-verbal and the verbal, and how, like, even though we as individuals have been shaped by words and by number, by structures that make it possible for us to speak with each other, to understand each other, to be comfortable with each other, there is still in our lives the underlying and sometimes sleeping underground the existence of the prelingual impression and the prelingual conception of the world. And this is something that I was hoping the exhibition can bring forward, is basically the sensory and sensible way to understand things that goes beyond those structure or before those structure.
I love that term, free linguistic. And that's something that I'd love actually for you to expand upon. The idea of having an idea before you have the language for it.
It's something I got interested, I think in 2019. It was shortly after the birth of my first child. And I was thinking about making new sculpture, and I was observing the way he puts things in his mouth. I was also observing my dog as well, who also put things in the mouth. You know, I think a dog behaviorist wrote that the way dog understand something is by putting it in their mouths, and sniffing something is reading for dogs. And I thought this is really interesting how I don't think we're so far away from that. This way of understanding the world haven't completely disappeared from the way we make an opinion on things. And so I also started to think a lot about the way sculpture as a discipline specifically talks to the pre-linguistic. Specifically, I think sculpture is a pre-linguistic language because sculpture can be touched. They are made with pressure, with touch. They are made actually with what Melanie Klein would say ambivalent feelings, feeling of aggressivity and feeling of tenderness. They are made by some gesture of attack, of violence, cutting, slicing, compressing, hammering. And they also are made by gesture of tenderness, caressing, patting, massaging. So I grew really interested in the way sculpture talks to the prelingual, both in the way they are made and the way they are perceived, and the way the audience is also approaching them. I also was making this big exhibition show at the time in Middelheim. It's an exhibition in a park, public park. So it's interesting because the audience is not art motivated. I don't know how to describe. It's not the art motivated audience. It's people who wants to get a little bit of sun, who walks their baby or run or read a book in a quiet environment, or also people who have nowhere else to go or nothing else to do. And it was really interesting. It's a very large park for me to witness that very often people would, if they want to read a book and they are alone, they would decide to read the book next to the sculpture, even though they are not specifically interested in the sculpture when you talk about them. But the sculpture is a presence. And it makes me think a lot about how the sculpture is a body, and the way there's an impulse to touch sculpture as well. Often you notice sculpture have been touched at the same area, which is very often the round area. If you look at Egyptian sculpture I remember I made this observation first in London, in the London galleries, because they didn't had a lot of security, so you could touch sculpture at that time. It was a long time ago, more than 25 years ago. And you could see, that the nose, the breast, and the belly and the butt were the parts that were the most often touched. And I grew really interested in this idea that maybe, Freud said that writing is a substitute of the mother body. But I think that the sculpture is really a substitute for the mother body, both for the sculpture, the artist, and the audience who experience it. It's also this relationship with scale. Parents are a big body for a child, and as the toy is a miniature object. I think that this is something that I was really interested in the exhibition to bring forward, is the question of scale. How big is a sculpture is for me the most important question. I would say that it comes as the most dramatic, stressful question before even if the shape is good or not.
It's really impressive to hear this from you and understand how that was translated into the exhibition space. There's something that we've been talking about in our preparations for this dialogue, and it was behavioral conditioning and how people behave in a space. And I'm wondering if we can talk through the exhibition itself and some of those key themes you learned with that public sculpture in the park, and how they're translated into your decision to place certain objects.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that it's a key element for this exhibition. I've been working with Adam Charlap-Heyman for now it's, I think, the fourth exhibition we're doing together. And since it was my first show in New York, first show in New York with House and Verse, and second show after my first show, Bad Dad and Beyond, with Metro Pictures. And Adam is New York based, so it was really exciting to work together on that show. One of the key, really first idea we had was that we wanted the space to feel like a public space. And to be honest, I think gallery space are some kind of public space because they even are more, they feel more public than a museum. Like there's less security search. You don't have to have your bag searched. You don't have to pass, these little security portals. I think there's something really generous and interesting in the. Also, there's no commitment because it's free. You don't need to take a ticket. So I like very much gallery space for how addressable, or I don't know how welcoming they are. Especially in New York, I think that's something that if you go to Paris and you go to galleries in Paris, you will notice they don't have that immediate accessibility. Like they don't have, very often they don't have those giant window on the street because they are ancient buildings, or they have courtyard. And so there's something about how close to the street and close to the public space the gallery is that I wanted to reinforce. And I thought, since I want the exhibition to feel like it's almost outdoor, outside, even though it's indoor, we were thinking with Adam, what type of surface brings the idea of outdoor, but is an indoor surface? And we thought about this rubber floor, which cover, playground, also like in outdoor in Central Park, like a lot of playground in New York now, outdoor have these materials. It's also the material for the gym, which is supposed to signify outdoor because, they do it for tennis courts as well. It's kind of a substitute for the earth or for the grass because it has the tenderness and the morbidity. Do you say morbidity? Do you say when something is soft?
You can, yes.
Yeah, it has this sort of qualities that you can dive into it a little bit, where the concrete floor, it bounces back. There is this hardness to it that immediately sends the signals to your brain that if you would run, you would, it would be hard for your muscle. And if you would fall, you would probably hurt yourself. If you sit on it, your ass is going to be cold. I think that this rubber floor for me was a way to communicate a sense of freedom and comfort. And actually, I didn't know, but Augustin Fuentes, the anthropologist, which going to do the talk on Saturday at the gallery, told me that there's been a lot of studies that the soft floor are kind of like calming to the nervous system immediately. Like this is kind of a universal effect. So this was kind of from the start a way to tell people this is a space that's welcoming, where you can move around. And as a result, I noticed people don't move too much close to the wall or around the sculpture. There's not like an itinerary that's very linear. There's a lot of like back and forth. I think maybe just because it's more pleasant to walk. So because it's more pleasant to walk as an experience, there is much more, I would say, inefficiency in the way people move in the space. There's more playfulness. Yes. Actually, we had children yesterday. Why the Rainbow came with a group of children, and I was giving a tour, but I said, like, I don't think I want to go from one work to the other. I think like for 10 minutes, everybody should feel free to kind of like run around, because this is the way, I think the best way to experience the space is just to move around without stopping, one by one. Especially, I think sculpture is actually made to like turn around and like you turn your head and then you discover new angles. There's this idea of chance encounter and chance perspective also that I wanted to encourage. Personally, I don't like too much in an exhibition when you feel like the artist and the curator and have been trying to kind of like propose like one specific angle in which this exhibition needs to be seen and experienced. I feel like then it becomes theater, it becomes like a stage. I think the force for me and the power of exhibiting sculpture is the power of like offering a space around the sculpture that is full of possibilities. You can go under, you can go in between, you can look at something through something else. I think this is really how, like, almost I want it to feel like a forest, you know, so things are constantly framed and there is obstacle, but when you find it beautiful, it feels more like it's your opinion on it. Nobody has been trying to plant that idea in your head.
Yes, when I visited the exhibition, it felt quite dynamic. There was no beginning or end, and the ways that the sculptures and the works were installed, it really did question how my body felt in the space, and it really encouraged me to move around the space, as you mentioned. I'm curious if there's any anecdotes you have of unique engagements with the space or what you saw as you were visiting the exhibition over time.
Yeah, I have a funny anecdote, and it's like when we were having the press release, you know, some of the sculpture moves, like all the pearl, they can move. And the dog that's running away, if you touch it, it kind of wimble, you know, it go back and forth. And so I was explaining that, and I was touching the dog, and the security guard, who is now a friend, um, she saw me from really far, and she was like, "No, don't!" really screaming. And then she recognized me, and she was like, "Oh, no, sorry." And I thought that this is really an interesting moment because, you know, one of the painting has this big don't written on it. And so there was this, I just realized that there's this sort of like Russian doll kind of like thing about the exhibition itself in terms of the fact that um, it's not super clear what you can and what you cannot do in it. And it posed a lot of questions. Like, for example, I have a lot of people asking me yesterday in the kids, like if the little seat for the security guard is part of the exhibition or not. And one of the women who were there with them, she said, it's funny because we've been to like many other Chelsea galleries and nobody has asked that before. But I guess it's because the floor brings the idea that all objects are signifier. So then any object is a signifier, even the bench of the security guard. And in that context, I think the security guard is quite important in my exhibition. And actually, when you go see the exhibition, you will see that she knows she's an important part of that exhibition. And the idea of like, you know, the mix of like respect and discipline and appreciation and playfulness, I think it's already something that it's the topic of the show, but it's also kind of like something you experience in a way that's different here than other gallery who all have a security guard as well and all have a seat for the security guard. I think that there's also another anecdote that I found interesting is like a lot of people didn't notice the floor grid was distorted. And I thought this is really interesting because, we did the Bernini effect. What I call the Bernini effect is the idea that the line become, it's a forced perspective, basically. And I thought that was kind of like one of the first things that would jump the eyes when people come to the exhibition. But I think the force of the grid visually is so strong that we trust the grid to be loyal, to be, so to say, normal. And it made me think, you know, the grid is such an image of normalcy, you know, like what is, we're so accustomed to think that we need to fit into square, you know. It's unbelievable how for us, people who live in city, I mean, the square is the natural shape. Well, I mean, it's a shape that you encounter nowhere in nature. So yeah, I guess in the interaction between the audience and the exhibition, there was a lot of new questions that arise. Of course, the glove as well. There's been a few people tripping on the gloves. And the security guard, she was noticing what type of people do it and, you know, like she's been counting what day it happens. It's been a really interesting exhibition to watch in contact with the audience. Also, there was this like worry about the dogs that some of them are quite fragile, and you know, somebody would be tripping on the leash, and actually people have been very respectful of the dog, and it's been really interesting to see how much more enthusiastic the New York audience was to this presentation, because I've shown the same installation in Switzerland, and it absolutely didn't have the same resonance. I guess it's because it's inspired by New York, and the dog of the Upper West Side, specifically the rescue dog. That in the Upper West Side, all the dogs are a little bit like traumatized, or they have had accidents. People tend to. I like this idea that I feel like there's such a strong, anti-establishment, anti-competitive, spirit in the Upper West Side, that people will always adopt the most difficult dog, the one who's will be left. So like the giant dog, or the dog who's missing a leg, who's blind, or the dog who's aggressive. I've had so many interesting interaction at the dog park. So this installation, to see it in New York, and to see the New Yorkers making photo of their dog with the installation, has been very a big joy for me.
I understood from one of my colleagues that you were inviting people to bring their dogs into the exhibition space.
Yes, yes.
I was so surprised by that, because I mean, I'm surprised and I'm impressed at the same time, the way that you've created a space that is not so fragile and not so cold. It's really warm and inviting. And this way that you are cleverly also kind of interrogating the viewer. I remember the guard when I walked past the bronze gloves sitting on the ground, and I felt their intense stare. And I need to be very careful. It's almost like really wanting to behave a certain way, but
Yes,
yet being given the freedom to explore.
yes. Yeah, it was really interesting. We had a conversation with the security guard also at the beginning. She was like, "Oh, do you want, people to have their dog attached, behind the office, or do you want them to like roam around with their dog?" And I was like, I mean, I'm always like more a partisan. How do you say? Like, I'm always more up for freedom in general, in movement. But she was like, what if a dog like attack one of the sculpture of the dog, or what if they pee on it? And I was like, okay, let's wait until this happen, and then we we can decide what we'd do. But so far it hasn't happened that any dog has been aggressive with any of my dogs, so we're fine.
Excellent. Let's back up a little bit and talk about the relationships that you have set up between the objects. For me, it calls to mind a film of yours that was made over a decade ago called Gross Fatigue, that I think at least we all should know at this point. And the ways that you questioned institutional categorizations and the ways that we make meaning through objects. And I'm just wondering if for you, there is a connection between that film and this ongoing body of work.
Yes, it's interesting you asked the question, because this year has been like the 10th years. It's been 10 years that Gross Fatigue was shown at the Venice Biennial. So I had a talk with Legacy Russell. We had this talk at the beginning of the year at the gallery, and a projection and a screening, and I hadn't been watching the film since a long time. I was thinking about it, but I can see how probably having to prepare this talk kind of influenced the work I made later for this exhibition, because I think that the painting do have the same layering kind of onion process to them, and I think there's many connections to be made. I think also Gross Fatigue has a lot of like connection with thinking around the categories that humans have created in order to map the world, and map knowledge, and as a start, the category between nature and culture, animal and man. I think these categories are the one I want to question the most in the film. But I think that it's also a common point in this exhibition where the dog as a start is a way to talk about, okay, this is a domesticated animal that has been so humanized, so anthropomorphized, that is it still an animal for us in our culture? But also, you know, if you want to talk about education, I think that if you talk about education of children, education of dogs, it's like very similar topics. It's very interesting. I always like to use something to talk about something else. Like for me, it's interesting to use dog training to talk about children education. But then children education is also a way to talk about politeness. And politeness is a way to talk about politics. I think that there is a strategy in the exhibition that you see a little bit in Gross Fatigue to use very banal, everyday, kind of almost futile and comical element in a way to bring a sort of like, then, you know, the guard are not so high. You're not like crispy, how do you say, like tense, because you're like, oh my God, this is kind of like a very important topic. I have to have an opinion on that. It's just, I like this idea that to approach people through things that are very relatable, but also that feels banal and familiar, because I have a strong belief that in this banal and familiar element lay the possibility to think very deep aspect of our relationship to the world, the system we've created. I think that in Foucault, for example, The Order of Things, in his introduction, you can already have a little bit of a glimpse of that, you know, if you want to talk about topics that are very heavy, very loaded with information, you need to start with the things that's probably the most light or the most, you know, banal. Like it doesn't bring any stress. Like if you're showing email of like nail polish and manicure hands, then you can show image of Oppenheimer masturbation, you know, of dead animals. I think that's a strategy of mine, that I like, that things that are very banal, very familiar, sometimes also feels easy to criticize, and almost you look at them with irony already, like the manuals of manners and behavior. They feel so inoffensive, you know, they feel so I don't know how to say inoffensive. Does it exist in English?
Yes, yes, unoffensive, or yes, inoffensive.
Unthreatening, you know, unthreatening. But if you look at them closely, you're like, oh, what happened? No, like, okay, they are ridiculous because maybe, you know, all this code of like rules about what to do, what not to do, it's quite ridiculous. I want to do what I want. But then you're like, oh yeah, I want to be myself, and individuals with like free will. But then yeah, the question of free will is like, oh, is this such a futile question after all? And what happens if we don't have code of behavior? Do we end up with a world of bullies, or do we end up with a world of loneliness? So this is a little bit like, I think Grosse Fatigue and this exhibition have in common this sort of like mixture of elements, that some of them are like bring a smile on your face already, this collection of cats with eyes of different color, because it's a very subjective kind of random type of search. And then other bring a much more heaviness. And I think that I'm interested in the way the world to us now appear as this sort of like random series and sequences of things that are very light, very amusing, funny, and things that are extremely heartbreaking, devastating, heavy. I mean, this is an experience of being online. I think this is an experience in social media is even more extreme. I think when I did Grosse Fatigue, I wasn't even on Instagram, and I've never been on Facebook. So, and I'm not on TikTok. So I wasn't thinking too much about social media, but in the way Instagram has accelerated even this feeling of intense proximity of devastating news and like funny anecdotes.
Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack in what you've said, but what I want to pull upon is the idea of the banal and the everyday, and the ways that that manifests also in the floor that you designed with Charla, Hyman, and Herrera. That map, or excuse me, the floor that you've mapped is also a reference to the studio, no?
Yes, it's a reference to the way I work in sculpture and the importance of this question of scale. Because when you do things in volume, you need that map, both in digital technique, like in 3D, the grid is actually the floor, but also the way to enlarge any object since Rinascimento, since Renaissance, has been the grid. And in my work, like in the way I make sculpture, actually, I don't use 3D for the artistic part of to define the shape. I make everything by hand. First in small, I make a small model, and then the small model and the drawing, we put a grid on it, and then we enlarge it with my fabricator. But with the eye, you're just using the grid and the eye. We're not printing it in 3D for most of those sculptures. Some of them I had to do it because they were very much off center, and they were presenting like challenges in terms of like engineering. But it's more like, yeah, I would say we're using 3D more for technical verification and pricing and weight and all those things. But yeah, the grid is very much like the element that allow any sculptor, any person who works in 3D to change the scale. So in a way, the grid is a scale. But yeah, it's also kind of a way to say, we're here, the floor is important. Your gravity, the fact you're walking on your feet is important. I think as a child, all the sensation walking on your feet rather than on your knee and hand, or like crawling on the floor, nothing is obvious. And so the floor is not obvious either. And I think that what the grid also communicates is this idea. It's a way to tell people, look, you're there now. The grid is also a way to map and to send coordinate. So it's also a way to bring the importance of the location, being there at a certain time, at a certain place. And when you move in space, you change coordinate. That's the way your phone constantly know where you are, is because the space is as a grid, and there's a satellite who send information to this grid, so you're being located. And so this is the grid and the large abacus form, very much like signifier of this dominance of the mathematics in terms of like coding information, and making us aware both of the existence of this mathematical algorithm system, but also an awareness of being there, in terms of like this precise position of mind. It's almost, like a war game also, where, the position of every participant is important. I think that there's also something of that, when you walk on a grid, you're constantly jumping from a box to another. So there's also this idea of crossing a frontier. And that's also why it makes people want to walk more or run around. I was wondering, actually, it was a little bit of an experiment. I was like, what if we didn't have the line? Would people had moved in the space differently?
Oh, I think they absolutely would have. I mean, it really warms the space up. And I realize you're going to speak more about this at your talk on Saturday with Adam, but just to return to what you said with regard to his research, there is an impact that the floor has on an emotional state. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, this is something Augustin Fuentes told me while we were preparing our talk, that there's been studies about how it calms down the nervous system. So the heartbeat is slower, and people are feeling generally a little bit more happy. and more relaxed. So I asked him to kind of like talk more about that on Saturday, actually.
Fantastic. I'm curious about the abacus, the beads. Can you speak to their position? Because I did see that they move, obviously, as an abacus is intended to be a counting device. Can you speak about your decisions to place the beads in the various sculptures?
At the beginning, the beads, I placed them a little bit like just, I treated them as mass, really, which is also what abacus is, to treat numbers as mass, like basically as densities. And but then I started to think about, what number did I do? Like, what number am I saying when I position these beads? And because I'm dyscalculatee, which means like I things are constantly inverting in my head. I I've always had a little bit of a stress with numbers. Like I approach number with always a little bit of fear, because I constantly doubt my ability to remember them or to pronounce them correctly, especially like in English. Now I've added a layer to this insecurity. But so this is a little bit how like the idea of the title came across. And then I started to think about, the resonance of like those numbers, like what does 3, 4, 7. It's interesting because there's a growth, it's a sequences that grow, and then it deflated, and I think you have a bit that feeling with the sculpture, that it grows and it's deflated. I wanted it to feel also like the wind, which is a force that increase and decrease. So that's a little bit like the thinking for these specific sculpture for the beads. I think each sculpture has a little bit of a different logic in terms of like what they mean to me, and the shape and the placement of the beads. The sculpture that is at the center of the exhibition, the one that has the arc, a little bit like a rainbow. For this sculpture, I was more thinking about a certain sense of infinity. So it's the number is not so important to me. Then the shape of the sculpture itself is kind of an infinite sign. And 7 and 3 are numbers that have quite mythological signification. Both of them, the two of them are not like pair number. They are impair. Do you say pair and impair?
Perfect and imperfect, is that?
Yeah. A number that can be divided into. Call it in English.
A perfect number.
A perfect number. Yeah, perfect and imperfect. Yeah, so this is 2 imperfect numbers. But the shape of the sculpture itself is an infinite sign. And so I think there was, for me, behind this sculpture, there was also this idea of like a signifier of infinite, the infinite signs, the sand, and the breast, the idea of the abundance. So it's also the shape that's turned around. It's also the Bernini column and the opulence corn. The thing that in painting means abundance. The trumpet of
Yes. It's quite interesting that these 2 imperfect numbers make a perfect number, though, which is not always the case.
Yes, it's true.
And I appreciate that. And they make a very easily divided number, which is 10. It's easy to multiply.
Yeah, which is also the number of the finger in the hand, which it's a very important number, 10, because we have like a very we have 2 times 10 in our body. We have both the finger of the feet and the finger of the hands. So this is a number that we have, I think, a specific relationship with for that reason.
I think you're absolutely right. And it brings us back to exploration and play and understanding things through our bodies before we have the language for them.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's a really wonderful place for us to open up for questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Let's do it.
Thank you so much, Camille and Allison, for this conversation, which has been such a joy to listen to. I'll go ahead and ask the first question, and I encourage our audience to submit your questions at the link in the chat if you have them, and we'll turn to you next. Camille, I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the do's and don'ts paintings and sort of how they connect the sculptures to maybe some of your video work. I feel like there's a lot of layering in them and a lot of creating linkages between how we experience space online versus how we experience space IRL, and a lot of playfulness. Especially there's one with mail that I just love that really gets at how mail collects, but also how it sits in our mind over time. And I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit about those.
Yes, yeah, I think the painting, yeah, we didn't get, it's a good question because I was thinking, oh, we didn't even get to speak too much about the painting, which is like one of my favorite thing to speak about, because in a way those cultures are difficult to speak about because they are in this bilingual kind of like zone, but the painting talks a lot. They are very gossipy, I would say. And I'm really interested in the nature of like words, especially like lingo, jargon. So one of the paintings, a Dante, that has, all the lingo and jargon of the code of the computer when it crashed. Another painting, which is one of my favorite, the one who has the mail from the Who's Who in France, that is collaged with the verb to be in German. And there's a little like administrative form from the school of my child, and a little piece of a book about evolution, and the years are actually the years of the good wine to have at the table from Nadine de Rothschild. And I always like to joke that this painting for me is a little bit existential, French painting. But I'm using like a really like banal element. Like I like that Who's Who, which is like a little bit of a trickster kind of organization who just basically wants you to pay to be in their book that nobody is consultating anymore. But I think it addressed, the question of like, who am I to the eyes of other? What is my place in society? And the verb to be in German is also, when you learn a new language, you discover the meaning and the power of words. And the verb to be in German have maybe a different resonance as the verb to be in French or in English or in Italian. The way it's used, be in English is very different in the way we're using this word as, an addition in French language, for example. There's many moment where we use have instead of be. So it's just basically the exhibition. I wanted to question a little bit our relationship with language, and through this idea of like the accumulation of like unsorted element in our life, which I think the mail is, before we had emails, we had the mail. And the same way, etiquette books is a little bit of a normalizer of behavior, but Instagram is a normalizer of behavior as well, because everybody can see how other people do their makeup, where people go on holiday, what they are wearing, and that makes them think, oh, I should do that because we're a gregarism, we're a space ruled by gregarism. So these things are the same, except that some of these things are very obsolete. The things I'm using in the exhibition are quite obsolete, like they're quite outdated. But like Ghost Fatigue, I was using a very outdated, design. in terms of like the computer window. They come from a very old version of the computer.
Thank you for that answer, Camille. I really enjoyed looking at those paintings when I was in the space. I have an anonymous audience member question about who your artistic influences are.
Oh, so that's a complicated question for me because I have so many and I change. I'm not a very loyal person in terms of influence. But I would say that Sigmar Polke played a like defining role in the paintings. I mean, first of all, because the Sigmar Polke Foundation was the one who commissioned me this series of painting in the first place. So the idea of working with authority, with the family system, with society as an oppressing frame came from reading Sigmar Polke catalog. And then I worked with his printer as well because I broke my hand while I was working on this series. So he definitely influenced, not only influenced, but he actually is the origin of those paintings. For the sculpture, I have a lot of different reference. I would say Germaine Richier is a French sculptress that I think is lacking recognition. I hope that she's going to have a big show soon because we haven't seen enough of her work. I've learned recently why that Giacometti felt very threatened by her and asked his gallery to kick her out, and then she never recovered. That is actually one of the reasons I think about her often. There's a specific struggle to, I think, women artists that are sculpture because of how much it's costly as a practice and heavy and difficult to storage and difficult to maintain without resource. I think about Louise Bourgeois a lot. Of course, I like her. I'm a New Yorker that was a Parisian before. My mom was also an artist and a craft person that taught me a lot of things. I've always, like her, been a handy, like working with hands type of person. I'm like her, coming from a family that I've been trying to escape through marrying somebody from another culture and another language and another religion. So like her, I have a little bit of anger and issue with my father, or in more generally my culture, I would say. There is Maria Lasning. I think that in painting, in terms of like color, but also her life and the way she represents the inside. You know, I was talking earlier about the dynamic of the outside and the inside, and we wanted inside to feel outside, but we also wanted the exhibition to feel like you're inside a brain, or, you know, it's a monde intérieur, it's the interior world. And I think that Maria Lasning, I feel like first time I discovered her work, I was really like overwhelmed, and I felt like I couldn't believe when the painting had been done. I thought it was like a young artist of like my generation. I couldn't believe how much visionary and bold and yeah, in advance of her time she was.
Thank you so much for those answers, and thank you for that question, audience member. We have an audience member who is curious about how you mentioned Foucault and wonders if you've thought about Guattari or Deleuze or Derrida as well in the past or in the present.
I would say Deleuze, yes, quite a lot, because I studied animation films, and Deleuze was Image Mouvement was kind of like everybody had to read it, and we had even had to do like a reading of it. And but it's funny, I don't think about it so much now. I think about The Fold, and actually maybe it's a good reference for, like, I need to read it again because I think maybe there's something interesting for me to take in The Fold, you know, in relationship with the sculpture, especially the one with the arc that we've seen. But in general, I like the sculpture who have wrinkles, you know, where things are like falling on each other. And uh, what other, I think Derrida, I think maybe around notion around the difference and like, the way we like, are we thinking separate? Are we thinking together? What does it change in terms of like angle when we look at the world to focus on what's make us different or what make us alike, which is also the question of Foucault in The Order of Things. I think for me, the takeaway of The Order of Things of Foucault always has been the idea that in the past, the way, especially in Renaissance and medieval time, um, the way the world was organized, it was by things that look alike or feel alike or are close. And since the 19th century, we've been organizing the world by the way things are separated and are apart. And I'm just wondering, and it's just like a wonder, like I don't think we've been feeling as much divided and as much like ruled by difference as now in terms of like time, the way, not only the way we speak, but also the way, the way science is organized, the way academic curses are organized, the way politics are developing. So I'm just wondering, if there will be a bounce back, because I always think when we're going too far in direction, there's an elasticity in culture and like we stretch back to the other direction. So I'm just wondering if this is going to happen at some point when I'm still alive, that we see a focus on things, similitude and like a feeling of connection and complicity between things rather than opposition. Are we going to see that, in my lifetime? This is really a question.
Thank you for that answer. And thank you for that question, audience member. We have a question. We have three more questions if you'll have them, Kemi. We have a question from Kathleen, who is curious, who says, your beautiful drawings and paintings are so fluid in their lines. They act. Do you feel that the sculptures seem to act like the drawings?
I think yes. I mean, for me, movement is really the most important feeling. I think that one of the things that I try to do in sculpture that I'm interested in is like, I want them to feel like they are animated, like they are about to become. And actually, the one sculpture we didn't describe, the one that looks a bit like a shoe or like a fern that unfolds, I was inspired by, Science Museum. They have this pedagogical sculpture that explain, how plants grow and how dinosaurs fit in the egg and how things grow inside the egg. And so I think that I really wanted this culture to be about growth, like croissance, how things expand. And I don't know actually what I was going to. What was the question? Forgot.
The question was about how the sculptures act relative to the drawings.
Yes, I think they are animated by an intention. So this one is expanding, another one is like a cycle. The other sculpture, the very large one, 3773, is like blown by the wind. So there's a feeling of like fragility. I kind of like that they feel like a little bit like an instantané, like a moment in time. And they will, the second after, they might become something else. Um, it's funny actually, when the kids were there yesterday, one of them was like, oh, especially like for this sculpture, the one we were looking at just before, they were like, oh, it looks like a plant that's growing on another planet. So that was such a cute description of the sculpture. I thought like this is exactly what I wanted it to be. I like that they are. I don't know if they act. I think they are. They are. I don't know if they are. Maybe they are being acted upon. More they are pushed by a force stronger than them. I would say more than they are actor. Um, Although maybe sometimes they do, but when I think about my sculpture, I think that they have more like the passivity of a plant that is moved by the wind rather than the agency of like a human, I would say.
Thank you, Camille, for that answer. And thank you, Kathleen, for that question. The next question is from Magli. Magli, I'll pass you the mic.
Thank you so much, Camille and Allison. This was such a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed the show, Camille. I wanted to ask about what a day in the studio looks like for you and wanted you to elaborate a bit more on what you were saying about the floor being an ode to how you map things out for your sculptures.
What is a day at the studio? So generally, I arrive, I make my tea. There's always a moment where I have to, because I work a lot also with Europe, and I have still my family a lot, like the studio where I make sculpture. So in general, like I always have to take a little hour to process the different type of requests coming from Europe or communication with the fabricator, especially because you start working very early. So if we want to be able to interact, actually kind of like talking with him is the first thing I have to do. In the morning, we exchange pictures. Sometimes I call him on the phone. And then generally I always cook lunch because I don't like to go out. I have a lot of food allergy and it's too expensive in New York. So I but because I'm also very lazy, I generally eat just like a canned fish, like a cat. And with gluten-free bio toast. And what else? And then in the afternoon, I draw or I paint if I can, because it's not always possible. I hate to say, but I'm really not drawing and painting as much as I would like to. I feel like the invasion of like emails and all type of requests, and now we have social media. This has been eating so much time. It's really a problem. I haven't solved it fully. But there is this moment right after lunch where I read a little bit in my place in the sun. I have a little like long chair with like um very comfortable and I can read stuff. And then I draw with very loud music and a playlist I've prepared until the moment where I have to go home. Sometimes I pick up my kids in school. Sometimes I arrive after, and that's it.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on whether your sculptures, do you draw them first or do they just start as sculpture?
No, I draw them first.
Yeah.
I always start with a drawing, and actually I it's very important for me that I don't try to do a clean version of that drawing because I really want to keep the energy of the sketch. So I make a first drawing, and if I try to explain more detail, I make another drawing, and I circle the area that it's about. But I always have what I call the reference drawing, which is drawing that contain really my intention about this culture. And then I do all the drawing to explain all the angle and all the stuff. But it's everything is with drawings. And the model is really, it needs to look exactly like the drawing on one angle, but my drawing is not always very precise. I like to keep it sketchy.
Thank you so much and congratulations again on the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more question and then we'll go to the reading. I am curious, Camille. I was lucky to do a pre-meeting with you and Allison before this, where you talked a little bit about your relationship to time in your work and how you think about time and generational perspectives about time relative to different crises that we're facing right now and relative to how we live day to day. And I'm curious if you can talk a bit about how that creeps into your work and into what you think about in the studio.
Yeah, it's actually I'm reading the silent language these days, and it made me think that actually time is often a topic. Like I did this, card. It's kind of a, I don't know how to describe what type of work it is, but it's kind of a number you can call and gives you prompts to find excuses when you're late. So it's called Late Bloomers, and it's a help hotline that you call, and you have to decide if you want excuse if you're late at the doctor, or if you're late at the office, or if you're late with a family meeting or your lover, if it's an important occasion or not a very important occasion. And so I think that this hotline was very important to me. I'm somebody who's like, I hate to say, but I'm actually very often late. And I have really a lot of difficulty with integrating a linear idea of time. It's been a personal struggle of mine. And as I was reading The Silent Language, it made me realize that, the way we as a society right now behave with time is very purely American. Because if you look at other culture, time is absolutely not such a value, such a priority at all. Like the idea of finishing a task or being agreeable and nice to the person that you're spending time with, or not interrupting this person, is more important than how much time has passed. And I think it's really good to remember that, and to look at other culture, and to just also realize that all manners, all code of behavior that we think is, spread out of the world, is kind of very specific to American business manners. Like we've adopted all the behavioral, transactional, quality of doing businesses specifically in America. And even if you go to the UK, it's already different. So I think it's really this is something that I'm thinking a lot right now.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you, Allison. This has been an absolute pleasure. I know, Camille, you have a short reading that you want to close us out with, so I'll pass the mic over to you for that.
Okay. I hope you don't listen. There's no too much noise around me. Okay.
No, it's perfect.
Okay. So please be tolerant with my terrible French accent. I hope people understand what I'm saying. So it's an extract from The Dawn of Everything, which is a book by David Graeber. And it's page 3. It's actually the introduction of this book. There's a reason why in English the words politics, polite, and police all sound the same. They all derive from the Greek word polis, or city, the Latin equivalent of which is civitas, which also give us civility, civic, and a certain modern understanding of civilization. Human society, in this view, is founded on the collective repression of our baser instincts, which become all the more necessary when humans are living in large number in the same place. The modern-day Hobbesian then would argue that, yes, we did live most of our evolutionary history in tiny bands who get along mainly because they shared a common interest in the survival of their offsprings, which is called parental investment, as evolutionary biologists call it. But even these were in no sense founded on equality. There was always in this version some alpha male leader. Hierarchy and domination and cynical self-interest have always been the basis of human society. It's just that collectively we've learned it's to our advantage to prioritize our long-time interest over our short-time instinct, or better, to create law that force us to confine our worst impulse to socially useful area like the economy, while forbidding them everywhere else. So he continues saying, as the reader can probably detect from our tones, we don't much like the choice between these two alternatives. Our objection can be classified into 3 broad categories as account for the general course of human history. 1, simply aren't true. 2, have deep political implication. 3, make the past needless dull. So actually, his theory is to contradict all the idea that we were forced into rules to because our human nature was to oppress each other. And this is a whole, like the whole book is a demonstration that there's many times, not only we have alternative to a society that is ruled by people oppressing each other, but there were multiple examples of that in history and all over the globe.
Thank you so much, Camille, and thank you, Allison, and thank you so much, Leah at Camille's studio, and thank you to Christine at Hauser and Wirth for all of the help in preparing for today's event. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor the New Social Environment Program and make conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, which is where this will be very soon on YouTube. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our team, our operations, and our writers. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Keisha Scarville and Dr. Makita Best on the occasion of Scarville's solo exhibitions Recess at CPW Kingston and Passports 2012 to 2025 at Higher Pictures. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank
you, everybody.
you. Bye
Thank you
bye.
very much, Allison.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Camille.
Thank you
It was
so much.
great.
Voilà.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Bye.
Congratulations.
Félicitations.
Go see the show, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Everybody, take care.